The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good day, everybody. Welcome to this IAGHG webinar. Very pleased today that we've got a webinar to present the outputs of COP24, COP24 negotiations, climate science and Paris implementation. And we're really pleased to have today Arthur Lee, who is Chevron Fellow on Environment and Climate Change. To let you know that we are taking questions. Please use the panel on the right of your screen to send questions through to us, and we'll try and address those at the end. Just a quick introduction then. As IAGHG, we're a technology collaboration program as part of the International Energy Agency since 1991. We have 33 members, countries and organizations, and that's going to increase because we're growing, and our members set the direction of our program. And we're a technical-based organization. We don't define policy. We're not policy prescriptive, just policy relevant. And what we do, the technology we work on mostly is carbon capture and storage. Everything from capture to storage and everything in between, and everything before and everything afterwards. So we produce many reports on many aspects of all the aspects of CCS, and also run the main conference series, GHGT, and we've just had GHGT14 in Melbourne. We run research networks and other conferences and other meetings as well. And we also participate in UNFCCC and IPTC meetings as well. And we can do all this thanks to our members, to funders, and those are some of the organizations that we are active in. So very pleased to introduce today Arthur Lee, who, as I said, is the Chevron Fellow for Environment and Climate Change. There's a bio on Arthur on your screen, so you can see his long track record with Chevron and with the American Petroleum Institute and with the US EPA. But more importantly, Arthur is a long-term attendee at the UNFCCC COP meetings, and he's a key member of the BINGO, the Business and Industry constituency there, and he works with and for IPECA and IETA as well, and he closely follows those tracks of the negotiations that are most relevant to business and to technology. And also he's been an editor, a reviewer and an author for IPCC as well. And lastly, from our perspective as well, he's a member of the IAGHG Executive Committee as the representative of Chevron. So welcome, Arthur Lee. Welcome, Arthur. We'll hand over to you now to present your assessment of COP24.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. You're able to hear me, I assume? And
yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good, very good. Okay. All right, let me turn on my screen and share it and make it full. As Tim mentioned, I'm very pleased to be here and also have been a member of the IEA Greenhouse Gas Program, and I cannot overemphasize the kind of work that the IAGHG has done in terms of CCS, and really contributed to the whole field of CCS. And Tim Dixon there, who introduced me, has really done a tremendous amount of work over the last many years, more than a decade, if not over 20 years, contributing to CCS. So thank you, Tim. In terms of the negotiations, I think one of the key messages that I really heard that got us to this point is the one that I put on the title slide here. There is a Paris rulebook now. In fact, the very first message that the COP president, who is the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Michał Kurtyka of Poland, he was the presiding officer or the COP president of COP24. What he said was that without Katowice, there will be no Paris. And so that was what he said in the first day of the basically the first day of the negotiations. And then, of course, in the last day, when he made that closing plenary and gavel closed the decisions, his last statement was, "We have done our best to leave no one behind. Overall, the interests of all parties have been balanced in a fair manner, and the impact is positive overall. This moves us one major step closer to the ambition enshrined in the Paris Agreement." Now, I know that this is a fairly self-congratulatory kind of message. To a large extent, I would agree that there is a Paris rulebook. It is there. However, I think it is still incomplete. It leaves, perhaps it left it did not leave a lot of people behind, but it did leave some folks behind. I think some of us in business and industry have been left behind, unfortunately. But I think the nations that are negotiating this do have the will, and I think the momentum to continue to do this and negotiate and continue negotiations specifically on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which I'll explain in a minute. Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay. If you let me digress for just one moment, just a bit of a personal reflection of observing the UN negotiations and reading all the scientific assessments in the last 20 years or so. I would say that some of this history predates my own direct involvement, but this table, I've used it in other forums before, other public forums, is that there has been over 25 years of history really leading to the Paris Agreement, and now coming out of the Paris Agreement to the Katowice or Paris Rulebook in 2018. The left-hand column is all about the scientific assessments, and it's simply a column where I just copy and pasted phrases or maybe even an entire sentence from the assessment reports, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC the reports, and also from publications like the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, just to illustrate what has been said over the years, and also the kind of messages that have evolved. So in 1990, the science was still very much emerging. Emissions. So the phrase there was emissions resulting from human activities are substantially increasing the atmospheric concentrations, and really at that time there wasn't as much or even much of any evidence to say that the emissions resulting from human activities are doing anything to the temperature rise. That was 1990, and the first assessment report was convened by the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, and UNEP, UN Environment Program, together, that formed the first IPCC, the IPCC process. And so that was in 1988, and which resulted in 1990, the first assessment report. Now coming all the way forward now to 2014, the fifth assessment, of course, has this fairly iconic kind of a key message about human influence has been detected basically in everywhere. Okay, and this evidence for human influence has grown since the fourth assessment. And then the 2018, of course, we have the special report on global warming at 1.5 degrees. And it's actually a very long title that has to do with eradication of poverty and et cetera, et cetera. But the key message there to me, and there are many, but the key message to me is that every bit of warming matters. Okay, that's what the scientists have been saying. It's not whether it's 1.5 or 2 degrees. Actually, the science shows scientific assessments since since at least the fourth assessment, if not the fifth, and then now 1.5 degree report, is that there really is no very sharp threshold at all about the kind of impacts that have been studied and that have been found. So that's why the key message here is every bit of warming matters. It's almost like a continuum. So which means at 2 degrees, the impact will be greater than at 1.5 degrees. So it's really, and it's a continuum. Okay. So the second column, the middle column, is all about the conference of parties, the negotiation sessions under the UN Framework Convention, which of course entered into force in 1994. Okay. So the UNFCCC is all about voluntary actions. And now fast forward to 2015 and then now 2018. So in some interesting way, the Paris Agreement now is back to a core part of the agreement is now again voluntary. Of course, we went through the whole more than 15 years of the Kyoto Protocol, which has a core part of it being mandatory on a subset of countries in the world. Okay, but now interestingly, through all the negotiation, through years of negotiation, is now back to a Paris Agreement whose architecture is a hybrid of voluntary agreements at its core, but also then supported by mandatory elements. Okay, and these mandatory elements are indeed what makes up what we would call the Paris rulebook. Okay, colloquially called Paris rulebook, and much of it has to do with reporting. There are other elements too, but reporting of actions to mitigate, that means to reduce emissions, and actions to adapt. So there are requirements of reporting about reporting financial flows as well, flows of finance from one country to another, especially around reducing emissions, as well as adapting to climate change impact. Okay, so that's what I want to say about the middle column. Is really about it's from voluntary to mandatory in the Kyoto Protocol, now back to mandatory at the heart of the agreement. And now the global emissions, of course, during all that time, and again this predates me, but still in the period 1990 to 94, we were roughly at 355 parts per million, and that was 28 to 29 gigatons of CO2 per year. And now fast forward to 2018, the latest average amount of CO2 concentration at Mauna Kea, Hawaii, at the observatory there, that the famous Keeling curve, is now 408 parts per million. So a few years ago, well, anyway, it would have been I would like to call this even number. It's a 50 parts per million story over the last 25 years. It's actually now a little bit over 50 parts per million. Okay, so that increase occurred during that time, from around the 1990 timeframe to now. Okay, so this is a bit of a reflection on the big picture and the history in one slide. Okay, I would call this the partial completion of the Paris Agreement. I give the negotiator plenty of credit, lots of credit for even coming up with a very complex rulebook, which is still over 100 pages. But I call it partial because for many of us, as Tim mentioned, I do work actively in the bingo community at these meetings. The business and industry NGO working the constituency at these meetings. And as some of you know, and you will learn that when you go to these meetings, the United Nations recognize you as part of a constituency. So we're divided up sort of in groups so that they can interact with us through focal points. And bingo, it has its own focal point, as well as environmental NGOs have their Climate Action Network, which is their focal point for environment NGOs, and others, like Tim is officially more part of the research industry, research independent institution, NGO, Ringos. And then there's a whole group of folks called the Youngos, which are the youth NGO, and there's a photo of them later in the slide pack. If I get around to it, I'll just talk about it. But basically, there are a lot of youth. The youth movement is very much a part of the negotiation. They are there. They're in the hallways. They're there in making comments and observations to officials there. In plenary meetings, they're allowed to make comments just like we are, and everyone is allowed to some degree, at the discretion of the COP president, to make comments. So anyway. I think in terms of bingos, I got sidetracked there a little bit. The bingos, one of the issues that many in the business industry really care about is cooperative approaches. Okay, studies have found, numerous studies have found, and one of the side events, in fact, at the one of the official side events, actually at the UN at this COP24. That was published and it was presented, actually found that cooperative approaches will save money for society. It will reduce costs, and in fact, it will help in certain cases countries that would otherwise not be able to reduce as much of their emissions cost effectively, or even reduce them at all, would be able to do that if countries are allowed to cooperate. And a lot of this cooperative approaches, they're all called for in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And some of these are market-based. So market-based meaning it could be emissions trading. It could even be carbon taxes. In economic terms, it could be carbon taxes. But somehow these, if there are any kind of carbon taxes, it would have to be coordinated and have to be some sort of wealth transfer as well between countries. Okay, and one of the and some of the key issues that really caused such great disagreement was over something called the share of proceeds, where where you do a project in one country and you are able to produce some emissions credits, if you will, and those credits would be transferred to the country that needs to use it to legally make its own emissions compliant, or I should say legally compliant with its own national laws. Okay, because again, these emission pledges or commitments by countries are voluntary, so it has no legal force under the Paris Agreement. But in individual countries, of course, any emission targets or goals set by that country should have, of course, by definition, legal force in that country. So emission trading between countries, if companies or other groups or NGOs do that kind of work and produce emission reduction in one country and are able to transfer that internationally transferred mitigation options to another country, that other country B, if you will, country B should be able to use it to meet its own contribution. Okay, so the share of proceeds mean there will be a tax, and that means the proceeds from this, a percentage of these proceeds, anywhere from 2 to 5%. I think one of the proposals that was tabled was 5%, would be taxed. And also the issue of something called corresponding adjustments. That means making adjustments like double entry bookkeeping, double entry accounting, as I think many companies do, or all companies do in the world. Double entry accounting, debit and credit. It's also become an issue, even though you would normally think there should be no double counting, but there is some kind of esoteric issue with respect to the whole UN Framework Convention from the Kyoto Protocol to now, and that's at least one country insists that in the very first round, in the transition period, for example, it should be allowed to make it. It should be allowed not to make corresponding adjustments because of the Kyoto Protocol has a clean development mechanism process. So, anyway, these are very detailed issues. In fact, so detailed that oftentimes it makes my eyes glaze over until you read it the third and fourth time. But these issues were, in fact, what was discussed in over actually 300 pages of these very detailed options, detailed text by technical negotiators, professional negotiators, and they had to go through that in 1 week. And then in the second week, all of that was presented to ministers who are at the level of like Mikhail Katika here, who's in the photo here, minister level, who are political levels. They would do the negotiations in much broader terms, and yet at the same time they still have to understand the details of what they're negotiating. And again, this was over. At the end of the day, it was still over 100 pages of text. Okay, so some of the issues that were of importance, I think, to countries, okay, mostly to a lot of countries, and even to companies too, is that there is now further guidance on the information, clarity, and transparency of the nationally determined contributions. Okay. Those of you who may not have been reading the NDCs may find this kind of interesting and perhaps even humorous, that there's the issue of common timeframes. Countries, in fact, because they are able to make voluntary contributions or commitments, really they can say in any format they wish to and submit their contributions in all sorts of formats, time frames, and targets. The targets could be a economy sector or economy-wide targets. It could be tons per dollar GDP and intensity target. It could be a percentage target of absolute emissions. It could be tons of target that would be compared to a base year. It could be a target compared to a baseline that's projected forward to the next 20, 30 years. And then the target could then be a reduction off of that baseline projection. So all of these nationally determined contributions have widely differing formats. And the time frames of comparing a lot of these goals and contributions are actually quite difficult. And so, at these negotiations, and also actually called for back in Paris, was that countries really should start to come together to common time frames. Okay, and one of the other mandatory elements of the Paris Agreement is what's called the global stocktake. And this, I think, in the future will prove to be probably the most impactful part of the Paris Agreement between nations, states and governments, because at the end of the day, no one can really enforce voluntary agreements, and no one can really enforce what one country can do and another country can do or choose not to do. So the global stocktake, what that does is, on top of voluntary agreement, this mandatory element is to require that nations really come forward every 5 years to talk about progress, to report through the mandatory elements of reporting what is the progress that they have made against their own nationally determined contributions. And they will do that all together in a public forum, globally visible public forum. Okay. So some observers have called this, in fact, in many diplomatic circles, these kind of things are called almost like name and shame. Okay. I won't necessarily call that myself, but that is, in terms of diplomacy, pressure is really, a lot of time, the diplomatic pressure is really around visibility, transparency, and about what one country says about another, but no enforcement. Okay, so global stocktake is a normal, become a normal process for countries to talk about their progress and perhaps even lack of progress. Okay, so an informal dialogue had already taken place at this meeting as well. That dates from the COP23 Fiji. COP23 was presided over by the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of Fiji. Okay, and so it's called COP23 Fiji. And from Fiji, something called the Talanoa Dialogue, where countries at this meeting had a conversation with each other, and also a conversation based on input from NGOs in the last year. Okay, and I think a lot of organizations have actually submitted comments and letters to the UN Framework Convention Secretariat to participate in that Talanoa Dialogue, or what was called the Talanoa Dialogue. But then 5 years from now, in 2023, will be the first global stocktake, and that is a mandatory element, like I said again, and will follow a certain set of rules. And those set of rules were what was also agreed to as part of the Paris rulebook. And there are issues that I track specifically, which I'm highlighting here: enhancing climate technology development and transfer through the technology mechanism, linkage of the technology mechanism to financial mechanism, which is really all about money. Okay, and I already talked about Article 6 already. Okay, so I know I took a long time there, but that really sets up a lot of the key things that were in the rule book. Okay, now I'm getting a little bit into the details. So I will highlight some of these details, but won't get into too much more of the details than what's on the screen. As I mentioned earlier, the 1.5 degrees special report was really a key part of the whole scientific assessment process. It was actually invited by the UN body, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the whole COP process, back 2 years ago, back in COP. Sorry, it was actually called for in. Sorry, I misspoke. It was actually called for in COP21 when the Paris Agreement was agreed to. So at COP21, all the countries agreed to the long-term goal, of course, of 2 degrees, with efforts to 1.5 degrees, and this dates back to that agreement because during the negotiations, the dynamics of the negotiations were such that a specific group of countries, especially the small island developing states, and to some degree some of the like-minded developing countries, as I recall, the LMDC block of countries, but mainly the small island developing states, they really called for 1.5 degrees as the goal. Okay, they really wanted that, and did their very best to actually use whatever negotiating tactic they had at the time to try to get that. Okay, so they were partially successful in that the long-term goal was a compromise to recognize that there has to be best efforts to 1.5 degrees. Okay, it doesn't say it is a goal of 1.5 degrees, but it has to be 2 degrees, or with that kind of efforts to 1.5 degrees. And as part of that compromise, nations did agree to invite the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to do a study that will specifically study several questions, but one of the key question is the difference. What is the difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees goal? Okay. So, excuse me. At this meeting, after the first week of the negotiations, sorry, just drinking some water. After the first week of the negotiations, the countries that are involved, all the countries that are involved in the meeting, they have to meet as part of this sub-process as part of this sub-process called SUBSTA, a scientific subsidiary body on science and technological advice. The SUBSTA process had a plenary meeting, a closing plenary meeting, where they have to make a decision on whether to welcome or simply note or even just recognize the special report of 1.5 degrees. Now, many of us technical folks, and I assume many of us on this call are fairly technical people, often find these kind of things interesting and sometimes frustrating because, I mean, the words, of course, they have a lot of meaning. Welcome is very different from just noting a report that was done at the invitation of the body that is now trying to decide whether it should be welcoming or noting the report, but it was invited. Okay, so there was a failure to reach agreement after the first week. Okay, and that really caused even some news media headlines around the world that this report really was not welcome. Okay. There were many attempts, even during the first week, at the end of that first week, to try to come up with some compromise language, but only at the second week, at the end of the second week, when the ministers, through all of their package of negotiations, finally, I think, had enough of a compromise that they came out with a decision, not through this SBSTA or SUBSTA process, but really as a COP decision that you can see here. So I'll just read the highlights. Recognizes the role, okay? It's not the report, but recognizes the role of IPCC input and doing all those things, and expresses its appreciation and gratitude. So it's not welcome here, okay? But it welcomes the timely completion of the report, okay? So you did it on time, great. We welcome that, okay? And then it invites parties to make use of the information, which is good. This is a good kind of invitation to use this report, information in the report. But it really, and then request, but the major thing is here, request the SUBSTA to, at its 50th session, that is mid-year this year, to refer to in the report above, to look at, to really continue to deliberate, okay, to consider at its 50th session report, including context of preparation of the 6th assessment of reports. So to use this report to really as the basis for the 6th assessment report, which has started, by the way, and of course that they would do it anyway. The IPCC would have done it anyway without the COP telling them to. But the second phrase, the implementation of the Convention and Paris Agreement, is actually an important phrase because that means the body of the COP and the body that will constitute the Paris Agreement will continue to use this report and the IPCC in a way that would be constructive. Okay, so after all of that, divergence of agreement and problem in the first week, finally we came up with a very elaborate language to, in a sense, to still welcome the report, the use of the report. Okay, so let me move on to the next one. And this here, and I think what this IEA slide, Tim kindly provided to me, points out a very simple, very direct, very clear message about the 1.5 degree report. Even in one of the iconic figure, there are 4 illustrative pathways. Okay, and the 4 illustrative pathways really are in a way illustrating how the world could evolve, whether demand patterns might change or remain the same or become even increasingly more greater than now, even of fossil fuel oriented, and increasingly so, or it could be overnight could become much more of a renewable energy world. Okay, so these go from P1 to P4. I said it in the opposite order, but basically the idea is from very quickly turning over to renewable energy, to even a world where we continue to use a lot of fossil fuels, in fact, even increasingly so in some ways. So which means, of course, to reach a 2 degree or even 1.5 degrees, you then have to really ramp down your emissions, turn your emissions down quickly. And that means the key message right here in the middle, removing bioenergy coupled with CCS, carbon capture and storage, and CCS itself from the portfolio of available options significantly raises mitigation costs. I think that really is a key takeaway from my presentation here, and from a lot of the work that the IPCC has done, and a lot of work that IEA, the IEHG has done. Many of the analyst organizations out there, research institutes out there, have said this over and over again. And the IPCC special report, 1.5 special report, again crystallizes this key message that without CCS, costs will just go up. And more importantly, bioenergy CCS, as you can see here in the illustrative pathways for even two, but most importantly for 3 and 4, is negative emissions. Okay, CCS is really the only technology out there now that can provide negative emissions. Okay, so that we can use bioenergy or even direct air capture. We need to go there, is to get the net CO2 out of the atmosphere. Okay. All right. So from this point on, I'm just going to give again quickly details. So common timeframes. I already talked about this. So what these common timeframes are actually have not been decided. What I actually neglected to make an excerpt of is actually one of the excerpt. Sorry, one paragraph in the decision from COP24 is that it continues to urge, the COP continues to urge the parties to really think about what common timeframes to use. So that has not quite been decided, and will continue the negotiation. But whatever they come up with, it will be used from 2030 onwards. So that's what the decision actually says. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And this is just a slide that I made up. Well, it's a slide that I used. I read through a lot of the nationally determined contributions in the last few years, and these are some of the countries that interest me. And I just made excerpts, very, very, very brief summary. I mean, so it's not always exactly the words in the NDC. So this is my own responsibility here. But I think I've captured accurately the reduction targets, the baseline years, and just some of the notes about what each country says about its own nationally determined contributions. So this is just an example slide to illustrate the varied format, the targets, the base years, the common, the non-common timeframes that countries have been using. Okay, and the various different actions that they will do. So because it is entirely voluntary, the core of the Paris Agreement is really voluntary. That's why this rulebook has been of such importance, to try to get people to report something, if not the same thing, at least something on a common basis to a large degree. Okay. And these are just some more details about how. Just a reflection on how, from an agreement of, say, one paragraph 13 in Article 4, because a rule book, by its very nature, has to be much more detailed. So it goes from a framework paragraph to a decision that was back in 2015. That was a COP21 decision in at least one paragraph, paragraph 31, that spells out what actually 13 means. Okay. And then it goes to this much bigger set of words here in Annex 2 that spells out what it means for parties to account for their national determined contributions, and what it means about the anthropogenic emissions, and about environmental integrity, transparency, etc., and the words avoidance of double accounting. So that translates to a whole big paragraph here. in Annex 2 of one of the decisions on the Paris rulebook, which is on Article 4. So all those words now become this set of words, okay? And that they need to use, for example, IPCC guidelines that were adopted back in 2006, and any subsequent, and certainly any subsequent revisions from that, and also then, and parties that draw on existing methods and other legal instruments have to say how they've done that. So all of this just provide a lot more details to parties. And I would dare say that even at this level, there's still room for interpretation in the future. But at least now there is narrowing some of the and clarifying some of what this paragraph here means. Okay. And this is and one of the negotiation tracks that I follow closely is enhancing climate technology development and transfer through the technology mechanism. I only made a kind of excerpt of several paragraphs here, just to note that just to note for you that the technology mechanism was actually operationalized back in COP16. Okay, so you can count how many years that's been already. But COP16 was Cancun. Mexico was the president then, and in the decision at the time, two bodies or constituted bodies were set up, called the Technology Executive Committee and the Climate Technology Center and Network, and the Green Climate Fund, for example, were also set up. Not part of the technology mechanism, but the two arms, the tech and the CTCN, were part of the technology mechanism. Okay, so this decision, it's important in a way. Again, a lot of these words may not mean anything to people like me as an engineer in the past, but now it has the kind of meaning where it actually says that the COP is paying attention to what the tech is doing and what the CTCN is doing, and also paying attention, even more importantly, to what the financial mechanism is doing, which is another set of constituted bodies that basically hold money and donations from countries that would be donated and used by other countries. Okay. So this set of negotiation, what that means is that countries are recognizing the work of the CTCN and again now encouraging them to work together. Okay. Again, I find this interesting and sometimes humorous to find that you would think that the organization could work together, but unless they're told by the UN Framework Convention, the COP body, to do so, they can choose not to. So this is what this is. It's really countries telling these groups to work together. Okay. And a little bit more of that. It's a separate decision, but there's some nuance here about excuse me, about seeking support from the CTCN and how that could go through the financial mechanism. Okay. Again, if not spelled out, it's quite possible that these constituted bodies may do things differently than what some countries want, and in many ways, many of the countries here involved in the negotiation, and I'm not just talking about developing nations, but even the developed nations. They want this to be what's called a party-driven process. They want this. They want the parties, the countries, to direct the work of these constituted bodies under the convention. Okay, so that's why year to year, every year, they go through this exercise of negotiating on decision to guide or tell these constituted bodies what to do. Okay, and so by 2020. This decision here specifically asks for taking stock of progress on the linkages between the technology mechanism and the financial mechanism, which means, of course, the officers and the committees of those that are running those technology mechanism and financial mechanism will eventually have to come up with some sort of progress report, and of course, hopefully, they will demonstrate some progress in how they work together. Okay. Okay, and one of the key issues that were negotiated during the meeting, the underlying issue, I should say, for reporting, the transparency framework, and any of the mandatory elements, especially the modalities, procedures, and guidance for reporting or transparency, has to do with flexibility. So I think at the end of the day, I think actually all countries, agreed. Sorry, I need some more water. Agreed that the smallest and the least developed countries, LDCs, they're called in UN language, the LDCs can be exempted from almost everything. They don't have to really do much reporting unless they choose to, and they can certainly, even if they choose to, they can do it almost any time. Okay, so that is one thing that countries did agree to. However, for the larger developing nations, there was a lot of discussion, lots of debate, and certainly negotiating tactics used during the negotiations that they would like to have more flexibility for themselves, and that they would have more time to do things. Okay. So the compromise was basically this language here. The MPGs, that's the modalities, procedures, and guidance, specify the flexibility that is available to those developing country parties that need it in light of their capacities pursuant to Article 13. Article 13 is the transparency provisions. Okay, so this grants them this flexibility, but I think the way it's worded is really more. A little bit more case by case. I think that is up for interpretation. Okay. So in light of the capacity is to be self-determined. Okay. It's case by case, but the key point is that it is self-determined. Again, sorry. So again, if you as a developing country party, you can say that, okay, I want paragraph 1A or whatever, subsection 2, and then paragraph 1 and the subparagraph A. I want that to be flexible. Then the mandatory part of it is that they shall clearly indicate the provision to which flexibility is applied, and really clarify capacity constraint why they cannot do it. Okay, and of course, this is noting that some constraint may be relevant to several provisions. Okay, and also provide self-determined estimated timeframes for improvements in relation to these capacity constraints. So they don't get developing nations. Okay, I'll put it this way in very blunt terms: don't get a complete free ride. Okay, because during the negotiations, as I observed them. Many countries in the developing world were strongly opposed to any flexibility to the developing nations. So the compromise was to really allow for some time frame, some transition period. So at the end of the day, it wasn't really a transition period, but more of stating what it is that you as a country, you need to do in order to come up to speed and be able to provide that information. And not have to use that flexibility in the future. Okay, so this was the compromise language. Still, there would be a technical expert review. Okay, but the technical expert review teams shall not review the party's determination to apply such flexibility. Okay, so you can see where you can imagine during the negotiations, and that's what happened actually, is that there was a lot of back and forth, and that's why this language is worded the way it is, in a very kind of back and forth way itself in the language. Okay.
Arthur, can I just, I hate to point out, we've only got 10 minutes left.
Okay, yes. So maybe I could just summarize very quickly that you can see that just from this, it is very much a back and forth process, and even for the mandatory elements, the rulebook really became a lot of compromise language as well. But it is flexibility that is not open-ended. So let me just say that and there's things about the global stocktake as well. So let me just cut to the chase of I talked about Article 6 already. So one of the key points really about Article 6 is that is that there are interpretations now that there are really two kinds of even under the actually there are two kinds of cooperative approaches. One is market-based and the other is non-market-based. I'll just focus my next remark on just the market-based mechanism. So even on market-based mechanism is paragraphs 2 and 4. So there's now interpretation that could be really two mechanisms, and that's becoming more and more that way. But some countries, especially one country, was very much promoting 4, but not really liking the fact that paragraph 2 will become a sort of a mechanism between countries. This one country, well, I'll say this, it's been widely reported already. Brazil actually want to really promote paragraph 4, much more of a UN-based, UN-centric sustainable development mechanism, okay, which actually could translate well from the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, so that is the pathway that Brazil is very much supporting. But because of this dynamic, Brazil was against a lot of the other things, other issues that were raised, and so that's why Article 6 has now been forwarded. It's not been killed, but it has been forwarded to the next COP for completion of these negotiations. Okay, so let me just get to. I just point out you have these slides later. I just point out that hopefully I'll give you a bit of a reader's guide to the Paris Agreement with names of these articles. And let me just get to these are just photos of negotiation. That's me, and some briefings of national delegations. But the important thing is this one here, is that Tim Dixon, as well as other distinguished experts from the CCS community, were at a side event that I organized, okay, on behalf of IPECA, International Global Oil and Gas Association for Environmental and Social Issues. So this CCS event was very well attended, and we talked about issues of nationally determined contributions and the role of CCS in NDCs and in what's called mid-century strategies. And this one, Tim, if you could please help me with this one.
Okay, I'll be quick. Thanks, Arthur. Just to say that we were very pleased to get the only official side event on CCS, and because it was the only one, we did put quite a lot into that, trying to cover both CCS applications to industry sectors and also CCS for developing countries. And as you can see there, we were very pleased that we had Thelma Krug, IPCC Vice Chair, presenting on the 1.5 report and its relevance to CCS. Interestingly, one of the themes of the overall COP was a just transition for workers, and we had somebody from a union talking about the relevance of that and CCS, how that aids that. And then with developing countries, we had, there's always a lot of interest from developing countries at these COPs, and we aim to share knowledge across to those countries that are getting interested in CCS. So Catherine Romanak presented work from the US on how they've demonstrated secure storage and what the assistance and funding is for developing countries that's available in terms of climate finance. And we had a great example from a small island state, Trinidad and Tobago, on their particular perspective and their potential to use CCS to reduce their emissions. And it ended with, very pleased that we had Mark Field, a UK minister from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who presented from the week before the Global CCUS Summit in Edinburgh. And the UK is also very proud to support CCS development in developing countries through its funding of the World Bank and ADB. And so he summarised that as well. So very pleased again to have that event, well attended. IISD, thank you very much for covering it. And the UNFCCC broadcast it live stream, and there's also a recording as well available through the UNFCCC website. Thanks. Back over to you, Arthur.
Great. Thank you. Actually, I don't have anything else. Really, these are just photos. I'll just flash through them quickly. And certainly at a gathering like this, there's a lot of lot of high-level interest and high-level participation. China, in the China Pavilion, there was one of these other CCS events as well, and I'll just leave it there. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Arthur. So we have a couple of questions. One is on the IPCC slide where we made reference to the capture rates work, and is there a reference for that? And I can answer that, and that's a report that IAGG is just about to publish in the next month or so. So that will be out soon. There are some older references around that, but this one includes that cost element. And then the second question is for you, Arthur.
Mm-hmm.
That is that, so does this rule book still mean that countries can choose whether or not to account for land use change and forestry?
Okay. That is a detail that I think wading through the weeds. I have not waded through the weeds on that, but I do think that article. Let me use my own guide here. One of the articles here in the Paris Agreement. Sorry, it's right here. The Article 5, of course, reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation, is very much a part of the Paris Agreement. And so I think in order to do anything with deforestation and forest degradation, there'll have to be some sort of baseline. Okay. The rulebook itself, if it has any kind of language that would exempt any land use changes from being accounted for, I would be very surprised. Okay, because even back in COP, well, anyway, back a few COPs ago, I think it might have been at Warsaw, the whole RED REDD plus RED plus reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation is really more from a national level. Okay, projects are not yet really available to countries to look at it on project by project basis, but more at a national programmatic level. Countries can account for its own deforestation and emissions from degradation. So that was already a decision made back a few COPs ago to do that. So if the Paris rulebook has something that contradicts that, I would be very surprised. In fact, I'm being very transparent here. I don't think I've actually read through all of the pages, but I would be surprised that land use changes are not part of the baseline.
Yeah, and I think certainly some of the NDCs submitted as well included land use change and forestry as well in the mitigation activities. So I think you're right there, Arthur. Okay, I think that's all the questions we had. So
okay.
With that, Arthur, thank you very much for sharing your expertise. I'm sorry for rushing you along a bit at the end there. We were really enjoying listening to the in-depth analysis and perspective that you were able to provide from a pretty unique position, really, because you do go into and follow the negotiations on these streams. So thank you very much for sharing that with us and our audience. Thank you very much here in IAGHG to Becky and James for working the system.
Right.
And thank you very much to everybody online for being the audience, for being interested, and for sending in some questions.
Right.
And we will make the recording of this available afterwards,
right,
so people can watch it in non-real time.
Right. So just let me say thank you to everyone who participated, and certainly thank you to all of you at IEHG, Tim especially, for inviting me to do this, and the organizers, like Becky and James. So thank you to all of you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Arthur. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Okay.